Dust covered everything in the old temple, thick as winter snow. Dan wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a gray smudge across his skin. His cleaning bucket sat beside him, filled with broken pottery shards and small chunks of carved stone. This was his 4th year working on Remnant Station, and he had cleaned hundreds of these ancient buildings. The Caith who built them were long gone, but their ruins remained scattered across this forgotten moon. The shrine room stretched before him, its walls covered in faded symbols he could not read. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the domed ceiling, creating patterns on the floor that shifted as the day passed. Dan found peace in this work. Most people thought cleaning old buildings was boring, but he liked preserving what remained of lost civilizations. Each artifact he carefully cataloged felt like a small victory against time itself. Something shifted in the debris pile near the altar. Dan looked up from his work, listening. The sound came again, a soft, rolling noise like a stone tumbling down a hill. He stood and moved closer, his boots crunching on scattered gravel. The altar had partially collapsed weeks ago, and he had been slowly clearing the rubble ever since a smooth object rolled free from the pile and bounced twice before landing in his bucket with a solid thunk. Dan stared at it. The thing was oval-shaped, roughly the size of a watermelon, and covered in what looked like scales. They shimmered in the dusty light. Changing from deep purple to silver as he tilted his head, he reached down and touched it carefully. Warmth spread through his fingertips immediately, far warmer than the cool temple air. The surface felt alive, somehow, pulsing gently against his palm like a slow heartbeat. Dan pulled his hand back quickly, then reached out again, unable to resist. The warmth grew stronger with each second of contact, as if the object recognized his touch. His mind raced through possibilities. The Caith had been warriors, yes, but their legends spoke of something else too. Companions, bonded creatures that fought alongside them. Dan had read about them in the archive files, though most researchers dismissed those stories as mythology. The files called them dragons. The research terminal sat in the corner where he had left it that morning. Dan carefully lifted the egg from his bucket, cradling it against his chest. It pulsed again, stronger this time, and he felt an odd sensation in the back of his mind. Not quite a thought, but an awareness, a presence. The terminal screen flickered to life when he set the egg on the table beside it. His fingers moved across the keyboard, pulling up every file related to Caith biology and cultural practices. Most documents were fragments, pieced together from ruins like this one. But one file made his breath catch in his throat. Royal dragon eggs, kept in stasis fields within temple sanctuaries. The Caith had abandoned their colony worlds during a plague outbreak centuries ago, forced to leave behind the eggs they could not safely transport. The file included a grainy image of an egg identical to the one sitting beside him. Its scales showed the same purple and silver shimmer. Dan read further. The eggs could survive for extended periods in stasis, waiting for the right conditions to wake. When they did wake, they bonded to the first compatible being they encountered. The bond was permanent, irreversible. The dragon would imprint on that person for life, creating a psychic connection that allowed them to share emotions and eventually thoughts that he should report this. Station regulations were clear about xenobiological discoveries. Anything living had to be logged, studied, and turned over to the proper authorities. The Caith Preservation Council would want this egg. They would take it to a research facility, study it, maybe even try to hatch it under controlled conditions. Dan looked at the egg again. That faint heartbeat pulsed against the table surface. He placed his hand on it once more and felt the warmth surge through him. This time, the presence in his mind grew clearer. Not words, but feelings, confusion, hunger, a desperate need for connection after centuries of cold darkness. The egg had chosen him. Not a scientist in a lab, not a Caith warrior or preservation expert. Just Dan, a maintenance worker who spent his days sweeping dust from forgotten temples. The thought seemed impossible, but he could feel the truth of it in that growing bond. His supervisor Rolf would notice if anything unusual appeared in his reports. The insectoid administrator watched everything on the station with multiple eyes that missed nothing. But if Dan filed his daily report normally, mentioned only the usual debris and pottery fragments, then no one would know. Not yet. Dan made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He wrapped the egg carefully in his jacket and placed it back in the cleaning bucket, covering it with empty supply bags. The walk back to his quarters felt longer than usual. Every person he passed made his heart race, certain they would somehow notice what he carried. But no one looked twice at a maintenance worker hauling his equipment at shift end. His quarters were small but private. A bed, a desk, a tiny kitchen area, and a bathroom. Dan cleared space on his desk and set the egg down gently. It gleamed in the artificial light, beautiful and strange. He pulled up more research files on his personal terminal, searching for anything about caring for dragon eggs. The file fragments were not helpful. Keep warm. Speak to the egg regularly. The bond strengthens through contact and communication. Dragons were intelligent, more so than most species gave them credit for. They understood language even before hatching and could sense the emotions of their bonded partner. Dan pulled his chair close and rested his hand on the egg's smooth surface. The warmth flowed into him again, and this time he welcomed it. That presence in his mind brightened, curious and aware. "Hey there," he said softly. "I guess we're in this together now." The egg pulsed once, warm and steady like an answer. 3 weeks changed everything. Dan's quarters had become a makeshift nursery, with temperature controls set higher than comfortable and every spare blanket wrapped around the egg. He talked to it constantly now, describing his day during meals, reading aloud from books about Earth, explaining the stars visible from his small window. The egg responded to his voice with gentle pulses of warmth, growing stronger each day. The bond had deepened into something Dan could not fully explain. When he woke in the morning, he sensed contentment from the egg before he even opened his eyes. When he returned from work tired and frustrated, waves of comfort flowed through the connection, easing his stress. It felt less like caring for an object and more like having a silent companion who understood him completely. Research consumed his free time. The archive files on cave dragons were scattered and incomplete, but Dan pieced together what he could. The Caith had not enslaved their dragons or controlled them through force. The partnership was mutual, built on trust and respect. Dragons chose their riders based on compatibility, seeking those whose emotions and values aligned with their own nature. Once bonded, the pair functioned as one unit, each protecting and supporting the other. Dan learned that dragon intelligence matched or exceeded most spacefaring species. They could not speak with vocal cords, but the psychic bond allowed complex communication once fully developed. Young dragons understood language immediately, absorbing knowledge from their bonded partner's mind. The thought both amazed and frightened him. This creature would know everything about him, every fear and hope and secret thought. His careful routine began to crack under outside pressure. Rolf had noticed the unusual supply requests. Dan needed specialized food supplements. High-protein rations he claimed were for personal dietary needs. The thermal equipment raised more questions. Why did a maintenance worker need medical-grade heating pads and temperature monitors? Rolf cornered him in the supply depot on a quiet afternoon. The administrator's compound eyes glittered as he clicked his mandibles together thoughtfully. "Your requisitions have been unusual lately, Dan. Care to explain?" Dan kept his expression neutral. "Just doing some personal research. Caith cultural practices related to food preparation. Thought I would try recreating some of their traditional methods." "In your quarters?" "With medical equipment." Rolf's antennae twitched skeptically. "The ruins are cold. I wanted to see how temperature affected their preservation rituals." The lie felt weak even as Dan spoke it, but Rolf seemed to accept it with a dismissive wave of one claw. "Humans and their strange hobbies," the administrator muttered, returning to his inventory screens. "Just keep it off station time." Dan escaped before more questions could come. His hands shook as he carried the supplies back to his quarters. How much longer could he hide this? The egg was growing, its warmth now radiating several feet in every direction. Soon it would be too large to conceal. That night, everything changed. Dan sat at his desk reading when the egg began to glow. Soft golden light pulsed from within, growing brighter with each pulse. He jumped to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair. The research files had mentioned this, but seeing it happen sent his heart racing. Cracks appeared in the surface, thin lines of light spreading across the scales. Dan knelt beside the desk, unable to look away. Through the bond, he felt new emotions. Determination, effort, a fierce need to break free and enter the world. "Come on," he whispered. "You can do it." The egg shook violently. More cracks formed, pieces of shell beginning to fall away. A small claw emerged first, no bigger than Dan's thumb, covered in wet membrane. Then a snout pushed through, and finally a head broke free. The creature inside struggled for several minutes, working to escape the confines of its shell. When the dragon finally tumbled free onto the desk, Dan could only stare. She was tiny, the size of a house cat, with scales that matched the egg's purple and silver shimmer. Her wings were folded tight against her body, still wet and fragile looking. But her eyes captured his complete attention. They were amber-colored, bright and intelligent, and they locked onto his face with unmistakable recognition. The psychic bond snapped into full strength like a door slamming open. Emotions flooded through Dan's mind. Hunger, sharp and demanding. Confusion at the new sensations of air and light and sound. Fear at being so small and vulnerable. But underneath everything else, a powerful sense of trust and connection directed entirely at him. The dragon chirped, a soft sound that reminded Dan of baby birds. She tried to stand, but her legs were too weak, still adjusting to working outside the egg. Dan reached out slowly, offering his hand. The dragon sniffed his fingers, then crawled forward into his palm. Her small body trembled with exhaustion. "Hey, Silver," Dan said, the name coming to him naturally as he looked at her shimmering scales. "Welcome to the universe." Silver chirped again and climbed up his arm to his shoulder, seeking his body heat. She nestled against his neck, her rapid heartbeat visible through her thin scales. Through the bond, Dan felt her desperate hunger intensify. He grabbed one of the protein rations he had stockpiled and broke off small pieces. Silver ate eagerly, making small satisfied sounds between bites. For hours, Dan sat with her, feeding her and letting her adjust to being alive. She explored his desk cautiously once she gained strength, sniffing at his terminal and books with obvious curiosity. When she grew tired, she crawled back to him and curled up in his lap, falling asleep within seconds. Dan looked down at the sleeping dragon and felt the weight of what he had done settle fully onto his shoulders. This was not a discovery he could report now. Silver had bonded to him completely. The files made clear that breaking such a bond would cause severe psychological damage to both partners, possibly death. The Cave Preservation Council would not care about that. They would see only a human who had stolen something precious from their heritage. Silver stirred in his lap, and through the bond he felt her contentment. She trusted him absolutely, without question or doubt. Dan placed his hand gently on her back, feeling the warmth of her small body. "I will keep you safe," he promised quietly. "Whatever it takes." 2 months transformed Silver from a fragile hatchling into a creature the size of a large dog. Her wings had strengthened enough for short, gliding jumps, and her scales had hardened into beautiful armor that caught light like polished metal. She could no longer hide in Dan's quarters. The space was too small, and her growing energy needed an outlet. Dan had started bringing her to the ruins during his shifts. The abandoned temples gave Silver room to explore while staying hidden from station traffic. She loved investigating the ancient cave buildings, sniffing at carvings, and pawing at loose stones with obvious fascination. Her intelligence became more apparent each day. She understood when Dan told her to stay, quiet, or hide. She recognized the different tools he used and would bring him the right one when he gestured. The psychic bond had evolved beyond simple emotions. Dan could sense her thoughts now, not as words, but as clear intentions and ideas. When Silver wanted to explore a new room, he knew before she moved toward it. When she felt playful or hungry or tired, he understood immediately. The connection worked both ways, too. Silver knew when Dan felt stressed about hiding her, and she would press against him reassuringly until his worry faded. Everything changed the day the Kaith arrived. Dan was working in one of the outer temples when he heard ships landing at the station's main dock. He looked up from cataloging pottery fragments to see Silver's ears perk up alertly. Through the bond, he felt her curiosity mixed with caution. His communicator chirped. Rolfa's voice came through, sounding more animated than usual. All personnel report to the main hall. We have important visitors. Dan told Silver to stay hidden in the temple's back chamber before heading to the station. The main hall was crowded with workers and residents, all talking excitedly. At the front stood a group of Kaith, the first Dan had ever seen in person. They were tall, easily 7 feet, with scaled skin and powerful builds that spoke of warrior heritage. Ceremonial scars marked their faces and arms in intricate patterns. The leader stepped forward. High Scholar Vin commanded attention without effort, his presence filling the room. His voice was deep and carried weight. We have come searching for remnants of our lost colony. Our ancestors fled this world during the plague times, forced to leave behind many sacred things. We seek any trace of what was abandoned. Dun's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what they sought. Vin continued, explaining how the Kaith had spent centuries searching their old colony worlds. They wanted to recover artifacts, yes, but more importantly, they hoped to find any surviving dragons. The dragons are the soul of our people, Vin said, his scarred face showing rare emotion. When we lost them, we lost part of ourselves. We have searched for generations, hoping that somewhere, somehow, one might have survived in stasis. The crowd asked questions about the search, about Kaith history, about the dragons. Dan listened silently, his mind racing. Silver was exactly what they sought. A royal dragon, hatched and healthy. The Kaith would be overjoyed to find her. They would also be furious that a human had bonded with her. After the meeting, Dan hurried back to the temple. Silver sensed his anxiety before he entered and came running to meet him. She was too large now to climb onto his shoulder, but she pressed her head against his chest in concern. Dan wrapped his arms around her neck. "They're here looking for you," he said quietly. "Your people, the Kaith." Through the bond, he felt Silver's confusion. She did not understand the concept of her people. She only knew Dan. He was her entire world, the one she had bonded to, the partner she trusted completely. The Kaith were strangers, their scent unfamiliar, their presence meaningless to her. Over the following days, Dan watched the Kaith team work through the ruins. They moved with reverence, treating each artifact with careful respect. Scholar Vin personally examined the temples, reading inscriptions that Dan could not decipher. His second-in-command, Tess, cataloged everything they found with meticulous detail. Dan had to be increasingly careful. Silver wanted to explore, and keeping her confined to small spaces made her restless. He started taking her out only during night shifts when the Kaith team slept. They would walk through the moonlit ruins together, Silver practicing her gliding while Dan kept watch for any observer's point one night. They had a close call. Dan was examining a collapsed wall section when his equipment caused part of the structure to shift. Heavy stones began falling, and Dan froze in the wrong position to dodge. Silver reacted instantly. She lunged forward and shoved him hard with her shoulder, knocking him clear. The stones crashed down where he had been standing seconds before. Dan lay on the ground, heart pounding. Silver stood over him protectively, her whole body tense and ready to shield him from further danger. Through the bond, he felt her fierce determination. She would protect him no matter what, even from threats much larger than herself. "Thank you," Dan said, sitting up and hugging her. "You saved my life." Silver made a low rumbling sound in her throat, pleased but still alert. She did not relax until Dan stood and assured her he was unharmed. The next morning, Vin made an announcement that sent ice through Dan's veins. "We will be conducting deep scanning of all the ruins," the High Scholar declared. "Our equipment can detect energy signatures and biological traces that surface examination misses. If anything survived in stasis, we will find it." Dan's time had run out. The scanners would detect Silver immediately. Her body temperature alone would register as an anomaly, and her unique biological signature would be unmistakable. He had perhaps 2 days before the scans began. That night, Dan sat in the temple with Silver curled beside him. He stroked her scales and thought through his options. He could try to move her off station, but where would they go? He could attempt to hide her in areas the Caith had already scanned, but that was risky. Or he could do what his conscience had been telling him for weeks now. He could tell the truth. Silver lifted her head and looked at him with those intelligent amber eyes. Through the bond, he felt her trust. She would follow whatever choice he made. Dan made his decision. Tomorrow, he would take Silver to meet Vin. Dawn broke over the ruins with colors that reminded Dan of Silver scales. He had not slept. Instead, he sat with his dragon in the temple, preparing for what came next. Silver sensed his nervousness through their bond and stayed close, offering what comfort she could. Her presence steadied him. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The Caith archaeological camp was set up near the main temple complex. Dan approached it with Silver walking beside him, her head held high despite her youth. Workers stopped their morning routines to stare. A few dropped their equipment in shock. Word spread quickly, and within minutes a crowd had gathered. Vin emerged from his tent, and the expression on his face made Dan's throat tighten. The high scholar stood completely still, staring at Silver as if seeing a ghost. His scarred hands trembled. Slowly, carefully, he dropped to his knees in the dust. Tears ran down his scaled face, catching in the ceremonial markings. Other Caith warriors reacted similarly. Some fell to their knees in reverence. Others wept openly, reaching towards Silver with shaking hands, but not daring to touch. Tess covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with disbelief and joy. Impossible, Vin whispered. His voice broke. A royal dragon. Alive. After all these centuries. Silver pressed closer to Dan's leg, uncertain about the crowd's intense emotions. He rested his hand on her neck reassuringly. Through their bond, he sent waves of calm, trying to ease her anxiety. Vin rose slowly to his feet. His tears had stopped, but his face showed wonder mixed with growing confusion. He stepped closer, extending his hand towards Silver. The dragon sniffed his fingers cautiously, but did not pull away. The high scholar's expression shifted as he concentrated. She is bonded, Vin said slowly. He looked at Dan with dawning understanding. To you, a human. The camp went silent. That joy Dan had seen moments before began changing into something else. Confusion, disbelief, and in some faces, anger. How is this possible? Demanded one of the warriors, a large Caith with deep scars across his snout. Only those of Caith blood can bond with royal dragons. It is our law, our sacred tradition. Dan forced himself to speak steadily. I found her egg in one of the temple shrines. It had been in stasis, protected by the containment field. When I touched it, the egg woke up. 3 weeks later, she hatched. She bonded to me because I was there. I did not force anything or use any technology. She chose me. Chose you. The scarred warrior stepped forward aggressively. You are a thief who stole our heritage. That dragon should bond with a Caith warrior, not some human maintenance worker. Silver growled, low and dangerous. Her small size made the sound almost comical, but her intent was clear. She positioned herself between Dan and the angry warrior, scales bristling. Vin raised his hand, calling for silence. Peace, Garth. Let me think. The high scholar studied Dan and Silver carefully. He circled them slowly, observing how Silver moved with Dan, how the dragon's attention constantly tracked his position. The bond is real. I can sense it. She is utterly devoted to this human. Then break it, Garth said harshly. Surgically, if necessary. The dragon can be rebonded to one of our own. That would kill them both, Tess said quietly. She had moved closer, her scientific mind already analyzing what she observed. Look at the strength of their connection. It has been growing for months. Severing it now would cause fatal shock to both their systems. The dragon is too young and the bond too deep. Arguments broke out among the Caith. Some agreed with Garth that tradition must be upheld regardless of cost. Others sided with Tess, saying that destroying a living dragon went against everything they believed. The voices grew louder, more heated. Ven's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Enough. He looked at Dan with an expression that was hard to read. You understand the difficulty of this situation. Our people have searched for centuries to find what you stumbled upon by accident. That dragon represents hope for the Kaith. She is proof our companions can be restored. But she is bonded to you, and our laws are clear about who may bond with royal dragons. Your laws, Dan said carefully, were made when only Kaith existed to find these eggs. The universe has changed. Maybe your dragons do not care about bloodlines. Maybe they care about something else. You think yourself worthy. Garth sneered. A human who cleans ruins? I think Silver chose me, and I chose her back. That should mean something. Ven studied him in silence. Finally, the High Scholar spoke. There is a way to settle this. An ancient trial, rarely used even in our history. The Temple of Echoes. It tests bonded pairs, measuring the truth and strength of their connection. If you and the dragon can pass through it, then your bond will be recognized as legitimate by our laws. And if we fail, Dan asked, then the bond will be proven false. It will be severed, and both of you will likely die. Ven's expression softened slightly. I do not wish this outcome, human, but I cannot simply ignore our traditions. Too many of my people have suffered the loss of our dragons. They deserve answers. Dan looked down at Silver. She gazed back at him with complete trust, ready to follow wherever he led. Through their bond, he felt her determination. She was afraid, yes, but more than that, she was fierce in her loyalty. She would face any trial if it meant staying with him. When does the trial begin? Dan asked. Tomorrow at dawn. The Temple of Echoes is the largest intact structure in this complex. We will prepare it tonight. Ven pulsed. I truly hope you succeed, Dan. That dragon has already lost enough to time. She should not lose her chosen partner as well. The crowd dispersed slowly, Kaith warriors talking among themselves in their native language. Dan walked back toward his quarters with Silver at his side. Tess caught up with them before they left the camp. The trial is not designed for humans, she said quietly. It tests the psychic bond through stress and fear. Many Kaith warriors failed it throughout history. Be ready for anything. What do we face inside? Your own minds, Tess replied, amplified and turned against you. The Temple of Echoes dominated the ruined complex like a sleeping giant. Its dome stretched high above the other structures, covered in carvings that seemed to move in the early morning light. Dan and Silver stood before the massive entrance doors while the Kaith gathered in a wide circle around them. Ven performed a ritual blessing, speaking in the old language that Dan could not understand. The temple reads your bond, Ven explained after finishing the blessing. It will create challenges based on your deepest fears and strongest doubts. You must face them together. If your bond is true, you will recognize the illusions for what they are and overcome them. If the bond is false or weak, the temple will break you apart. Dan knelt beside Silver. She looked up at him with those amber eyes, and through their connection, he felt her absolute certainty. She did not fear the trial. She feared only losing him. Ready? He asked softly. Silver chirped once in response and pressed her head against his shoulder. The temple doors groaned open, revealing darkness beyond. Dan and Silver entered together, and the doors slammed shut behind them with terrible finality. The sound echoed through the vast space, then faded into silence. Light bloomed gradually, revealing a corridor that stretched impossibly long. The walls were covered in mirrors that reflected Dan and Silver from dozens of angles. But the reflections were wrong. They showed Silver alone, calling for Dan with desperate cries. They showed Dan walking away, leaving her behind in the ruins. Not real, Dan said firmly. He reached down and felt Silver's solid presence beneath his hand. We are together. The corridor shifted. Now the mirrors showed Dan chained and imprisoned while Silver was led away by Kaith warriors. She struggled against them, wings beating frantically, but she could not break free. Dan's reflection screamed silently behind bars. Pain lanced through his chest. The fear felt overwhelming and real. What if the Kaith did take her? What if they found some way to break the bond despite what Tess said? Dan could not protect Silver from entire species that wanted her back. Through their connection, he felt Silver's own terror rising. She was seeing something too, her own nightmare playing out in the mirrors. Her body trembled against his leg. Silver, look at me. Dan knelt and turned her face toward his. Whatever you are seeing, it is not real. I am here, right here with you. Her eyes focused on him gradually. The trembling slowed. Through the bond, Dan pushed every bit of certainty he possessed into her mind. He showed her memories of the past 2 months, feeding her when she was newly hatched, teaching her to glide, sleeping with her curled against his side. Every moment of care and connection that Silver's fear subsided. She pushed back through the bond with her own memories, Dan protecting her from falling stones, speaking to her gently each night, choosing to reveal her to the Kaith rather than abandon her. The dragon's trust in him was absolute and unshakable. The mirrors shattered. The corridor disappeared, replaced by a vast chamber. In its center stood an illusion of Ven and dozens of Kaith warriors. They surrounded Dan and Silver with weapons drawn. You have stolen from us, the false Ven declared. That dragon belongs to the Kaith. You are nothing, a cleaner of ruins. You have no right to such a magnificent creature. The words cut deep because part of Dan believed them. What was he compared to ancient warrior traditions? He was ordinary, unremarkable. Silver deserved better than a lonely maintenance worker who lived in tiny quarters and spent his days sweeping dust. You are wrong. Silver's intent came through the bond, so clearly it was almost like hearing her voice. The dragon could not speak, but her meaning was unmistakable. You are everything. Dan felt her perspective flood through their connection. She did not see him as ordinary. She saw the human who had carefully tended her egg for weeks, who had risked his career to keep her safe, who had spoken to her each night, filling the darkness with warmth and companionship, who had faced the Kaith knowing he might lose everything, but doing it anyway because it was right. Silver saw a partner worthy of her absolute loyalty, someone who chose gentleness over force, patience over ambition, connection over tradition. The Kaith valued warriors and strength. Silver valued the quiet courage of someone who protected what mattered regardless of personal cost. Dan looked at the illusion of Ven and felt his doubt crumble. I know what I am, he said steadily. I am her choice, and she is mine. That is enough. The false Kaith faded like smoke. The chamber transformed again, this time showing Silver an even more terrible vision. Dan stood before her, but his face was cold and distant. In the illusion, he spoke words that cut like knives. I never wanted you. You are just a burden, a problem I cannot solve. I wish I had reported that egg and let the Kaith take it. Silver recoiled as if struck. Dan felt her pain through the bond, sharp and devastating. The dragon's worst fear was simple: abandonment, being unwanted, losing the one being she had bonded to completely. Dan wrapped his arms around her neck. Never, he said fiercely. I will never abandon you. You are not a burden, Silver. You're my partner, my friend, the best thing that has ever happened to me. He meant every word. Dan had been lonely before finding her egg, going through motions in a life that felt empty. Silver had given him purpose, connection, something precious to protect and care for. She had chosen him when he needed it most, even if neither of them knew it at the time. The false Dan vanished. Silver pressed against him with such force she nearly knocked him over. Relief and love flooded through their bond in waves, the chamber filled with golden light. The temple's walls began to hum, a deep harmonic sound that vibrated through Dan's bones. The light intensified until he had to close his eyes against the brightness. When he opened them again, they stood in the temple's central sanctum. The walls glowed with the same golden light, and the ancient carvings seemed alive with energy. The massive doors before them swung open slowly. Beyond the doors, Dan could see the Kaith waiting. Ven stood at the front, his expression unreadable. But as Dan and Silver emerged into the sunlight, the High Scholar's face broke into a smile. He placed his fist over his heart in a Kaith salute of respect. The temple has spoken, Vin announced to the gathered crowd. Their bond is true. The Caith camp transformed overnight. Warriors who had viewed Dan with suspicion now treated him with cautious respect. The temple's approval carried weight in their culture, and even the most traditional among them could not argue with such clear validation. Ven had declared a day of celebration, and the ruins echoed with Caith songs Dan had never heard before. Silver basked in the attention. Young Caith warriors approached carefully, asking permission before touching her scales. She allowed it, curious about these beings who smelled similar to the ancient stones she had explored for months. Through their bond, Dan felt her pleasure at being admired, though she always returned to his side after each interaction. Vin found Dan sitting near the temple entrance as the sun set. The high scholar sat beside him without asking, his large frame settling onto the stone steps with surprising grace. For a long moment, they watched Silver play with a group of younger Caith who were teaching her a traditional hunting game. "I owe you an apology," Vin said finally. "I saw only what I expected to see. A human who had taken something that belonged to us. I did not consider that perhaps the dragons have their own wisdom about who deserves their bond." "You were protecting your people's heritage," Dan replied. "I understand that. Perhaps our heritage is not as fixed as we believed." Vin gestured towards Silver. "She is proof that the dragons care about character, not bloodline. That challenges everything we thought we knew about our own traditions." Tess joined them, carrying data pads filled with scans and research. Her excitement was obvious. The temple readings were extraordinary. Your bond strength matches what our historical records show for legendary Caith pairs. And Silver is developing faster than any hatchling in our archives. She is already showing signs of advanced cognitive function. "What does that mean?" Dan asked. "It means she is exceptionally intelligent, even for a royal dragon. The bond with you is stimulating her development." Tess pulled up images on her pad. "Look at these neural scans. She is processing language at levels we did not expect to see for another year. She understands everything you say to her, Dan. Everything." Dan looked at Silver with new appreciation. He had known she was smart, but hearing it confirmed by Caith experts made it real in a different way. Vin cleared his throat. "Which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you. Tess has been analyzing the stasis field data from the shrine where you found Silver's egg. She believes there may be other eggs in similar containment fields across our abandoned colony worlds. Other dragons." Dan's heart raced at the thought. Possibly dozens. Maybe more. Vin's expression grew serious. "For centuries, we believe them all lost. But if Silver survived, others might as well. The problem is finding them. The containment fields are degraded after so long. They need someone who understands preservation, who can recognize the subtle signs of failing stasis technology. Someone like Dan," Tess added. "You have 4 years of experience working with Caith ruins. You know how to identify and carefully handle degraded artifacts. More importantly, you approach our culture with genuine respect." Vin leaned forward. "I'm leading an expedition to search the old colony worlds. We need someone who can work with our archaeological teams. Someone the dragons might choose to bond with if we find more eggs. I'm offering you a position with the search effort." Dan stared at him. "You want me to leave the station? Travel with your team? We would pay well. Provide proper equipment and training. And you would be helping restore something precious that was lost." Ven paused. "But more than that, Dan, the dragons might need someone like you. The Caith have changed over the centuries we have been without our companions. We have become harder, more focused on war and strength. Perhaps that is why Silver chose you instead. You represent what we used to value before we lost our way." The offer was enormous. Dan had spent 4 years in the same station, cleaning the same ruins, living the same quiet routine. The thought of leaving felt terrifying, but through his bond with Silver, he felt her excitement. She wanted to fly among the stars. She wanted to search for others like her. The adventure called to something in her dragon nature. "I need time to think," Dan said. "Of course. We do not leave for another week. Consider it carefully." That night, Dan sat in his quarters for the last time in a while. Rolf had approved his leave of absence with surprising enthusiasm. The administrator admitted he had known about Silver for weeks, having accessed security footage of Dan's unusual behavior. But instead of reporting it, Rolf had trusted Dan's judgment. "You treated those ruins with more care than anyone I have ever seen," Rolf explained. "I figured if you were hiding something, you had a good reason. Turns out I was right." The other maintenance workers threw a small farewell gathering. They were amazed at the transformation of quiet Dan into someone about to travel the galaxy with a dragon at his side. He accepted their congratulations awkwardly, still not quite believing it himself. Silver had grown to the size of a horse now. She could carry Dan on her back for short flights, and they spent his last evening on the station soaring above the ruins together. The wind rushed past as Silver's powerful wings beat steadily. Through their bond, Dan felt her pure joy at flying with her partner. They landed on top of the Temple of Echoes and watched the stars appear. Dan ran his hand along Silver's neck, feeling the solid muscle beneath her scales. She was strong now, confident, ready for whatever came next. "Are you sure about this?" he asked her. Silver turned her head to look at him with those amber eyes. Through the bond came her response, clearer than ever before. Not words, but meaning so strong it felt like speech. Together. Always together. Wherever you go. Dan smiled and rested his forehead against hers. "Then I guess we were going exploring." The Kate ship left 3 days later. Dan stood at the viewing port as Remnant Station grew smaller behind them. Silver sat beside him, too large now to fit in his lap, but still pressing close. Ahead lay unknown worlds, ancient ruins, and possibly more dragons waiting in frozen sleep. Dan thought about the day that Egg had rolled into his cleaning bucket. Such a small moment. Such an ordinary beginning. He had been just a maintenance worker doing his job, and now he was flying through space with a dragon, searching for lost treasures among the stars. Silver chirped softly and nudged his hand. Through their bond, he felt her contentment. She did not care about grand adventures or important missions. She cared about being with Dan, facing whatever came next as partners. He scratched behind her ears the way she liked. "Ready to find her family?" Silver's response filled him with warmth. She already had her family, but she was happy to help find more. The ship jumped to faster-than-light speed, and the stars blurred into streams of light. Dan and Silver faced the viewport together, looking toward their future. Whatever they found out there, whatever challenges awaited them, they would face it the same way they had faced everything since that first moment in the temple, together.